Hello, and welcome back from the atrium of the IMF World Bank meetings. I'm in the main building of the IMF, and this is part of the Atlantic Council's geoeconomic program. The subject this morning will be on Pakistan, and in particular, the issue that we're trying to dig deeper on is why Pakistan has failed to prosper as much as it might have done despite a lot of IMF intervention. And the background to this is the question about whether rising geopolitical tensions are undermining the effectiveness of the IMF and how that can be overcome. Here to discuss that with me, my name is Tamim Bayoumi, and I'm a former official at the IMF. And everybody calls me Tam rather than Tamim. Here to discuss Pakistan with me, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Reza Baqir. Reza Baqir I first knew as a young economist at the IMF, but of course he went on to do much more important things, and in particular he was the governor of the State Bank of Pakistan and is now at Alvarez and Marshall, he's a managing director there, and he's heading out of Dubai their work on sovereign debt. And this, of course, means, Reza, that you've seen things from all three points of view. You've been part of the IMF, you've been part of the Pakistan State Bank, the governor of it, and also you're now looking at things from the point of view of a private investor. So since we're talking about IMF and IMF programs, I want to start by talking about them. Now, I believe that Pakistan has had more IMF programs than any other member over its period, and yet it still seems to not have terribly high growth and to have consistent balance of payments difficulties. And IMF programs have consistently said that there are structural weaknesses in Pakistan. So the question is, why have all these IMF programs, including the latest extended funding facility, seem to have not changed the underlying fundamentals of Pakistan? And obviously there are two sides to this. The IMF negotiates a program with conditionality, but then the Pakistani authorities have to implement it. So let's start with the IMF side. Have the IMF programs been sufficiently robust in terms of bringing Pakistan out of its low growth, or could more have been done?
Thank you, Tam. It's a great pleasure to be back here with the Atlantic Council. I'm a big fan of the geoeconomics program, and it's good to see you again. As you rightly said, many programs between the IMF and Pakistan, but right at the very beginning, and as you said in your preface, I'd first like to actually congratulate the economic team in Pakistan, the finance minister in particular and the state bank governor for having negotiated successfully an IMF program. I have been there. It's not easy to negotiate an IMF program. When I used to be at the IMF, it seemed easy, but once you're actually on the other side of the table, it's a lot harder. You have the IMF demands, you have the political landscape to be mindful of, you have the potential social impact, you have the business community, you have many stakeholders, you have media in a place like Pakistan, juggling all of them, finding a way forward, which is a narrow path, and successfully taking it across the finish line is not easy. So I think first and foremost, congratulations are due to the economic team for having negotiated an IMF program. I think your question really comes to the heart of why so many programs. And I have come to the view that a core part of it is figuring out how to really tackle and make progress on some of the structural areas. So I roughly divide up IMF programs in two broad buckets in terms of the conditionality that they have. One is the macro conditionality, which is, are you meeting the deficit targets? Are you meeting the tax collection targets? Are you meeting the reserves targets? Are you doing what the IMF is telling you to do on interest rates? And all the usual macro stuff. But then there is the structural agenda. And I really look at that as what is holding down growth. And I think one of the reasons why there have been so many programs is missed opportunities in terms of prioritizing the structural agenda and growth. So I'll give you one example. Today in Pakistan, if I was to ask you under the new IMF program, what is the growth strategy? that doesn't jump out at you by reading the staff report. And I think that it is a good idea to, and this is actually more a piece of advice to the IMF than to anybody else, because they are calling the shots in terms of program design, is how do we feature growth more prominently in a way that's tangible? I mean, I'll give you an example from closer to home where we are sitting in the US, the CHIPS Act. $280 billion from the US federal government towards semiconductor development, subsidies of this amount, and they have had a big impact. Where is the strategy for how Pakistan is going to prioritize or support? And it doesn't need to be costly fiscal subsidies, it sometimes is the right regulatory changes, but identifying what are going to be the sources of growth. So I really think that it's good to think of that, it's good to lead with that. And until you get growth, that's sustainable, I think a lot of the other things prove to be very challenging. Happy to get into like some of the specifics now, Tam. I gave you an example.
Yeah.
So in probably nearly as many IMF programs that I can remember, one of the key targets has been raising the tax effort.
Yes.
Trying to get more people into the tax net. And I was going back and I was looking at the numbers in preparation for a conversation with you today, Tam. And back when we negotiated the program in 2019, July 2019, that was the first program after a number of years. The then finance minister and we successfully completed 6 reviews. But I still remember, what was the tax to GDP ratio right before when we started off? And that ratio was 10.2% of GDP. That's for the fiscal year that ended in 2019, so just when we were starting. I went back and I looked at the IMF report to what is the tax to GDP ratio projected for the fiscal year that just closed in 2024, so 5 years.
Right.
And that is 10.5% of GDP. And so over 5 years, there's been an improvement of 0.3% of GDP over 5 years. And more or less, there have been constant IMF programs, either existing reviews. Now, that's less than progress of 0.1% point of GDP per year. So when you're at that stage and you ask the question, why is that? I think the point I want to make is it's probably the case that both the debtor and the creditor can share some responsibility in it. And I think as much as I think Pakistan needs to ask itself the question, what could it do better in terms of bringing more people into the tax net, people who are not paying taxes, and what could it do more so that the unfairness in the tax system of squeezing more that are already paying taxes can be reduced? As much, I think the IMF needs to ask itself, what could it have done better? Because you're part and parcel. We have a saying in Pakistan that you can't clap with one hand. It takes 2 hands to clap. And so IMF has been with us every second, every minute of those 5 years. And so I think that it's probably a good idea to figure out what could the IMF have done better in terms of the tax policy recommendations, and how could it have taken on board some of the domestic political constraints. Let me stop here, Tam, but happy to share a few more thoughts around the whole IMF-Pakistan conversation.
Well, thank you, Reza. That's absolutely fascinating, and I think we do want to talk about that. I guess one question is, we've heard a lot over the last few years about Chinese lending and whether sort of the ease of access to Chinese money. Has that been used by Pakistan, and if so, has that been an issue which has made it more difficult for the IMF to, I mean, your basic point is the IMF hasn't had a real growth strategy. It's had ideas, but it hasn't had a real growth strategy as I understood it. Is part of that because, to some extent, sort of Chinese money has meant that it's more difficult for them to ask difficult questions?
There are 2 questions embedded in your question about, has the IMF not had a growth strategy? I want to clarify one particular point. My view is not that either IMF bashing or China bashing or any other type of bashing is going to really be the answer. My point on growth is that it needs to be a shared strategy, but that there needs to be more emphasis from the IMF on what specifically needs to be done by way of growth. There was a classic There's a neoclassical approach, which is to just stand back, remove the macroeconomic distortions, and growth will come. But the rest of the world is not doing that. The rest of the world is now a lot more active in terms of driving growth. That's why I gave the example of the CHIPS Act. The US didn't need to do that, but the US felt that it needed to do that because these are some of the engines of growth. So my point on growth, Tam, was simply that as a shared, it's a shared relationship between the IMF and the Pakistan, but a bigger emphasis on growth, perhaps led by the IMF. Concretely, what does it mean? More than just standing back, getting good fiscal, getting good monetary, what is it? Now, with regards to China, my view on China is that China has been a great friend of Pakistan. There's a saying in Pakistan that China is an all-weather friend, and it's a nice diplomatic way to point out that perhaps some other friends have not been all-weather friends. They've been friends in good weather, but when it's not good weather, they sometimes are not around. I can attest to it. I was the governor of the Pakistan Central Bank, and I can attest to the fact that China helped out. And China helped out when others were perhaps sometimes not as forthcoming. So first and foremost, you don't forget your friends, okay? Point number two, whether Chinese lending has actually undermined the effectiveness of IMF programs, which is, I think, the question that you were asking, or is embedded. And my view on that is very different. My view is that the IMF needs China as much as China needs IMF in the context of IMF-supported programs. Now, what do I mean? What I mean is that on the first part about the IMF needing China, the IMF is going to give a certain amount of money. I think this program is 7 billion or so, but it's not filling the entire financing gap. And the IMF is going to require other creditors to come in, and one of those creditors is China. So the IMF is going to require Pakistan to ask other bilateral creditors that you need to put in money. If the bilaterals do not put in the money or give the needed financing assurances, there's no IMF program. Okay.
Right.
On the other side, how does China need the IMF? And it's not just about China, it's about generally the bilateral creditors who have given support to Pakistan. In addition to the fact that they're giving this support out of friendship, they also want to have an independent seal of good housekeeping. They want to know that the policy agreements and all the above-the-line items are such that are making the IMF happy, so that the IMF thinks that debt is going to be sustainable, and this program is going to crowd in other source of capital, including from the private sector, so that the bilateral creditors, including China, including the GCC countries, they are going to be able to get repaid. Okay? So I see this as a relationship where the IMF and the bilateral creditors, they need each other for a program in a country like Pakistan to work. I think if successfully the program continues the reviews are successfully completed, it's sooner or later that other sources of capital will come in. Sooner or later, Pakistan will tap private capital markets. Sooner or later, multilateral development banks will step up so that some of these bilaterals can be repaid as well.
So, as I read it, the key, in your view, to a revival of Pakistan is real structural reforms, not simply getting the, as you say, getting the fiscal in order and all of that, lowering inflation. So what you've mentioned, the very low rate of tax revenue, which I think is one of the things.
Yeah.
But from your point of view, what are the other major structural changes that are needed to really revive Pakistan?
So I think another key structural area, Tam, is around the energy sector. And what is known in Pakistani jargon as circular debt, which is the intercompany arrears in the electricity sector, also in the gas sector. Again, I got to be in the economic team in 2019. Circular debt issues were around then. They are alive and kicking now. In fact, they may even have gotten bigger over this entire period. And so a question is, again, what has been missing in that? And again, I'll make the point that there's probably shared responsibility. I think it's probably couldn't be that all of the responsibility just rests with Pakistan. what could our friends who give us money have designed better as a way of solution for the energy sector problem. But the cost of energy right now is not sustainable in Pakistan, and if industry has to grow, and especially a lot of high-tech areas such as data centers are very energy intensive, a solution is needed. Now, it's not to say that not much has happened on the structural reform agenda. I think one of the achievements of the EFF program was the independence of the central bank. And there was a piece of legislation that was done.
Something you'd be particularly interested in.
That was a piece of legislation that was done. I think that the central bank, if you look at the conduct of monetary policy, the conduct on the balance of payment sides, it's been very good. The IMF report has also been complimentary about what the state bank is doing, and I think the passage of that law was helpful towards ensuring that a central bank is held accountable for goals. But in terms of the exercise of the tools for achieving those goals, it is given the space to be able to do that. Just like in good corporate governance, you have a board and you have management. The board sets the objectives, the strategic direction, but then you leave management to go and achieve those goals. So I just wanted to maybe clarify that on the structural side, some things have been done, but there is a lot more that needs to be done. IMF programs are also not static. All right, at each review, there is new conditionality. So part of my thoughts here are meant to be suggestions for a dialogue for what can be put by way of a growth agenda in the future reviews. Now, you said maybe macro is not as important, and I didn't mean to convey that. Macro is critical, fiscal is critical, but what ends up happening, Tam, is that invariably, fiscal targets may be missed because they're also extremely ambitious. If I look at the targets right now, they're very ambitious. So towards the time when the review has to be completed, because some of the targets are being missed, typically it's on the fiscal side, there is so much attention being given to what temporary measures can you do to fill that gap, that the space allocated for the authorities and the IMF team to talk about what is not being done on the structural agenda is crowded out. And staff just wants to go to the board with some requests for waivers, but also showing how the gap is being filled, typically as you raise excise duties on petrol, or some other Band-Aid type measures that are going to fill the fiscal hole. But that debate is so all-encompassing that we don't get a CHIPS Act in the end, or we don't get other similar pieces of legislation or regulatory changes in whatever are the right sectors of Pakistan, so that a lot of the investment potential, and Pakistan has a lot of entrepreneurial talent, a lot of that can be channeled into generating growth.
I'd love to go into the institutional setup in Pakistan, and we will. But before that, what I'd like to do is ask you about debt overhang. So, Pakistan has a lot of debt, and one could argue, some people have, that by borrowing a lot from the IMF on a fairly consistent basis, you've simply raised the senior debt, and that has actually reduced the areas in which the private sector can lend, because there's yet more senior debt. So the riskiness of lending to Pakistan has gone up. So has Pakistan started to get into some sort of bad cycle in which rising senior debt reduces the attractiveness to the private sector? This makes it more difficult to then borrow and do the kind of things that you were talking about, the entrepreneurship. Is that fair, or do you think that's not an accurate
Excellent
assessment?
question, Tam. I think maybe I'll begin by trying to clarify some of the facts, because as I mentioned, I think we want to congratulate the authorities, particularly the economic team, that there is a program. Now, does this program mean that the IMF is going to be lending more to Pakistan? Is the exposure of the IMF going to be going up? And the answer is actually no. Because a significant part of the IMF money, the new IMF money, goes to repaying old IMF money. And I want to illustrate that with numbers. In the fiscal year that closed in 2024, that closed in June 2024, There was about $3 billion worth of disbursement from the IMF. This is the previous program. About 1.6 of that, or about half of that, was used to repay the IMF from its previous obligations. If you look ahead now, and if you look at the current fiscal year and the next 4 years, or so over the next 5 years, I think the IMF is going to put in about $7 billion of new money. Over this period, the repayments to the IMF are $7 billion. Okay, so there's not that much new net money from the IMF. Okay, so so the extent of its exposure is not going to grow. And a question, actually, and it's just not a Pakistan question, it's for I think many other countries as well, is are the IMF programs too small? Are they too small to really make a difference? If, and this is a general point now, if the IMF is making a country go through a lot of painful, difficult reforms, should the IMF actually be stepping up more by its own financing? And by more, I mean in net financing, over and above what is needed to repay the IMF. That's a question that I think can be a broader question because it applies to many countries. I remember I was in the IMF when the European debt crisis happened. I went to negotiate the program in Portugal. Portugal, Greece, Ireland. You remember, Tam?
Yes.
We were in SPR.
Yeah, I remember.
The IMF gave a lot of money.
Yes.
If you look at the IMF access in percent of quota, astounding figures, okay? So that's a question, and I think that question that deserves some discussion. It's not a clear-cut answer. Now let me move to what you asked, whether IMF lending is actually causing a debt overhang. That's not my view, because the IMF exposure is still a lot less than, it's a small part of the total of debt of Pakistan. Pakistan external debt is around $100 billion. Let me start by saying what is not a major part of Pakistan's external debt. It's private external debt. Okay, of this 100 billion, bondholders, as of December of last year, according to the IMF figures, were only around 7 billion of that debt. Okay, so the answer to Pakistan's debt problems, and sometimes people call for doing something on the debt side with the private creditors, and that the private creditors are the main problem here. That's not the case for Pakistan. Pakistan has around $47 billion of its 100 billion to multilaterals. IMF is a small part of it. And then about 42 billion in bilaterals. Okay, so that's the bunch of the debt service coming due. And I think when you have official debt coming due in the foreseeable future, next year, the year after, next 5 years, it is very difficult to go to the private markets and convince private creditors to come in and lend to Pakistan, because they know that they are going to be repaid after.
Right.
The official creditors are going to be repaid.
Yeah.
Now, if there was appetite on the part of the multilaterals as well as the bilaterals in a voluntary manner, and perhaps to reward Pakistan for the tough things that Pakistan is doing and without requiring a debt restructuring, if they were to look at their obligations and find a way to push them forward and significantly reduce the debt service that Pakistan has due to official creditors, multilaterals, as well as bilateral official, take that out 7 years, 10 years, or reduce those amounts significantly, I'm very confident that Pakistan, in the very near future, could then access private capital markets. And that's good for the bilateral creditors as well. That's good for the multilateral creditors as well, because then there are resources available to service the debts on those official creditors. Until that happens, it's a harder sell for a country like Pakistan to go to private capital markets, and it has a cost. The cost is in terms of the yield at which such debt is issued. But if some of the obligations to official creditors are taken forward in a voluntary manner as a gesture of goodwill, reward Pakistan for the tough measures that it is undertaking right now as part of the economic program, I think it's a win-win for everybody. For Pakistan, it'll be able to tap capital markets at lower cost. And for the official creditors, they will have private sector money come in, which will strengthen the chances that they, as bilateral and multilaterals, will be repaid.
So I think the answer is yes, that it would be interesting if Pakistan's debt came down. I wanted to pivot to a last question, which is about, we've just had the Nobel Prize awarded to Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, formerly of the IMF, and Robinson. And of course, their work on why countries succeed and fail very much focuses on institutions.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk to you about that because what you already talked about the central bank becoming independent. What are the major institutional improvements that could be made in Pakistan? And as a subsidiary question to that, what are the main difficulties in implementing? You've been talking about how difficult it is to do many things. What are the main difficulties in doing all of that?
I think I define institutions broadly in terms of how do key stakeholders come together to resolve key economic governance issues in a manner that's inclusive and in a manner that is respectful and in a manner that creates a recurring way of talking to each other. And I think one of the key institutions that I would like to see evolve in Pakistan is a domestic dialogue that is inclusive on addressing Pakistan's economic problems. And by that I mean that to have economic reforms that are permanent, to have economic reforms where potential foreign investors don't have suspicions that these economic reforms may be reversed if there are any changes in the political landscape. You need to have reforms come out of a process that has domestic ownership across many different stakeholders, whether it's the government, whether it is the business groups, whether it is the NGOs, the civil society, a broad range of stakeholders. And any institution that I think at this point can promote such a dialogue, I think having economic reform measures, including on taxation, including on the energy sector, including on a whole host of other areas, coming out of that will give the comfort to potential foreign investors that these changes that are going to be done are there to stay. They're not being done at gunpoint because the IMF is going to then not disperse, but they are being done because of a domestic political process. I can give you an example. This is not just theory. Look at Philippines. Philippines, used to be a country about 15, 20 years ago that most of the international community was very worried about.
Yes.
And there was a turning point that came in the Philippines, and that was around 2005. I remember I used to be there. I was the head of the IMF office. And the IMF thought Philippines was going to come for a program to the IMF anytime. They had a domestic, 21 of their leading economists in the Philippines came up with a white paper called The Fiscal Crisis Facing the Philippines. It was not an IMF paper, it was a paper from the leading economists across the board, across the political aisle, across different affiliations. That paper created enough of a domestic consensus around some of the key economic reforms that the president of the Philippines found it politically palatable to go behind that program because it was a Filipino program. It just so happened that 80% of the recommendations in that white paper were very similar to what the IMF had been saying, but it was not an IMF program. It was a Filipino program. Philippines, since it did that, and some of those things were expanding the base of the value-added tax, making the tax system broader, more fair. Since it did those, Philippines has never come back to the IMF. In fact, a year and a half after it did that, the Philippines prepaid the IMF all obligations in one go. I think countries like Pakistan can do that if the policy packages come out of institutions that promote respectful, inclusive, data-driven, scientific debate and dialogue across all the stakeholders so that others can see that these changes are going to be there for good. And that is what you need to get long-term investment, in my view, in Pakistan.
Well, thank you so much, Reza. I took 3 things out of this, all to do with inclusion. The first is that you need a more inclusive discussion between the IMF and the Pakistan authorities. The second is you need a more inclusive discussion about debt and how it can be brought down, even possibly more directly than currently envisaged. And the third is that we need a better conversation across Pakistan so that it can create its own growth strategy that will move it to where we all want it to go. So thank you very much, Reza. That's it for Pakistan. In a quarter of an hour, we're going to switch to a rather different part of the world and a rather different set of issues, which is we're going to be talking about Ukraine and its aid recovery. So, so that's it from me. And Reza, talk to you soon.